The passage of the advance echelons of the bombardment and fire support units of the task force from Leyte to Lingayen Gulf was marked by persistent and damaging kamikaze attacks, plate number 73. One day after Admiral Oldendorf sailed forth on his voyage to Luzon, Japanese planes began to plummet down from the sky into his ships. On the 4th of January, the Omani Bay, an escort carrier, was damaged so badly that it had to be sunk. The following afternoon, the Louisville, Stafford, Manila Bay, Sao Island, and HMAS Arunta and Australia suffered hits or damaging near misses. On the 6th of January, off Lingayen Gulf, the fire support groups were again attacked by the largest and most deadly group of kamikaze planes encountered during the operation. At least 16 vessels were struck during the course of the day, resulting in extensive casualties both to ships and personnel. Admiral Oldendorf's flagship California received serious damage, as did the battleship New Mexico and the cruisers Columbia and Louisville. So determined and damaging were the Japanese attacks that a bombardment of the beachhead areas was impossible that day. Bad weather had minimized the effectiveness of the air attacks by the 5th Air Force and the 3rd Fleet, thrusting the brunt of the air defense mission on the escort carrier planes. An attempt had been made by the 3rd Fleet to maintain a continuous air patrol over all enemy airstrips during the 6th of January, but a solid overcast prevented the blanketing of the more northerly areas. Escort carriers of the 7th Fleet did their best to protect the accompanying warships, but their efforts were met by a resourceful and skillful enemy who had improved his tactics greatly since the days of Leyte Gulf. The Japanese pilots were now relatively well trained, and their deception measures excellent. They made full use of land masses, window, and counterfeit identification devices to escape radar detection. In addition, continuing inclement weather, together with the relatively large area to be covered, prevented the 3rd Fleet's carrier planes from effectively covering the numerous Japanese-held airdromes on Luzon and grounded the Army aircraft based on Mindoro. As a result of the heavy air opposition by the Japanese, Admiral Kinkaid requested that the 3rd Fleet repeat and intensify its strikes against Luzon on the 7th of January. This action necessitated cancellation of a planned sortie against Formosa, but the new mission was completed satisfactorily despite adverse weather. Enemy air attacks began to diminish sharply, indicating that his plane strength was nearing exhaustion. On the 8th, as the 3rd Fleet retired to refuel, only a handful of enemy aircraft sortied into the Lingayen Gulf area. The few remaining kamikaze bombers now appeared to be coming from the northwest. To eliminate this potential threat, General MacArthur asked that the China-based XX Bomber Command shift its main effort against Formosa from Keelung Harbour to the southern part of the island. It was also decided that a carrier-borne aircraft attack on Formosa would be preferable to continued 3rd Fleet presence in the Luzon region. Admiral Halsey's 3rd Fleet thereupon moved to the north and west, while the 7th Fleet's escort carriers, aided by all available land-based planes of the 5th Air Force, took up the task of direct support of the amphibious landings. To ensure adequate protection for the assault troops, General MacArthur requested Admiral Nimitz to retain in Luzon waters a reasonably large portion of the bombardment and fire support vessels temporarily assigned to the 7th Fleet. These warships, on 7 and the 8th of January, had accomplished their assigned mission by thoroughly pulverizing the Lingayen beach areas with naval gunfire. On the 9th, they stood by, ready to deliver call fire. Initial intelligence from photographs and numerous guerrilla reports indicated that the shores of the Gulf had been fortified by the Japanese. Enemy gun installations were found only on the eastern side of the Gulf, however, and a relatively small amount of counter-battery fire was required. Since the Japanese had withdrawn from the beach areas, an accurate assessment of the effectiveness and value of the naval gunfire was difficult to make. The work of minesweepers, operating in close conjunction with the bombardment and fire support units, was highly successful. Few mines were found in the area, and sweeping progressed well ahead of schedule, thus making the Gulf safe for shipping and amphibious craft. The assault convoys, meanwhile, proceeded through the Visayas and up the west coast of Luzon with only sporadic interference from the enemy. One notable attack took place on the 5th of January, when the Boise, with General MacArthur aboard, became the target of 2 torpedoes from a Japanese midget submarine. Fortunately, both torpedoes were avoided by prompt and skillful maneuvering, and the submarine was rammed and depth-charged immediately by a covering destroyer. In the early morning hours of the 9th of January, all amphibious shipping arrived in Lingayen Gulf. Japanese kamikaze boats succeeded in sinking or damaging several of the LSTs and LCIs, but the landings proceeded smoothly. The entry plan for Task Forces 78 and 79, transporting Y and 14th Corps respectively, was so well coordinated that the 4 attack groups, one for each division participating in the assault, were in position off their designated beaches almost simultaneously, along a front of 12 miles. I Corps, under Major General Innis P. Swift, consisting of the 6th and 43rd Divisions, landed on the left flank near San Fabian. Corps, under Major General Oscar W. Griswold and made up of the 37th and 40th Divisions, went ashore on the right, in front of Lingayen and Dagupan towns, plate number 74. The scheduled landing hour was 0930, and by 0940 all landing waves had hit the beach. Initial opposition on the beaches was limited to mortar fire from the hills in the San Fabian region, which damaged some of the landing craft. By late afternoon, the 4 division commanders had assumed control ashore. The Luzon landing operation was announced in a communiqué of the 10th of January. Our forces have landed in Luzon. In a far-flung amphibious penetration, our troops have seized 4 beachheads in Lingayen Gulf. The decisive battle for the liberation of the Philippines and the control of the Southwest Pacific is at hand. General MacArthur is in personal command at the front and landed with his assault troops. His ground forces of the 6th Army are under General Kruger. His naval forces of the 7th Fleet and Australian Squadron are under Admiral Kincaid, and his air forces of the Far East Air Force are under General Kenny. The 3rd Fleet under Admiral Halsey is acting in coordinated support. The strongest opposition to the initial inland progress of the Allied invasion force was met in the I Corps zone of action. As the 5 regimental combat teams moved into the mountains north and east of the San Fabian de Mortis beachhead, they encountered a long arc of well-emplaced enemy positions covering all avenues of approach to Baguio and to the Cagayan Valley. This line of defence, built along a series of ridges beginning at de Mortis, ran eastward and then southward through Rosario, Binalonan, and Urdaneta to anchor itself in the precipitous and rugged ground of the Cabaruan Hills. Again, the Japanese had skillfully utilized the advantages of the terrain to protect the strategic passes and roadways with heavily fortified and mutually supporting cave and tunnel systems, fully supplied with all types of automatic weapons, mortars, and artillery. Most of these caves were self-sufficient strongholds containing enough material and food to withstand a protracted siege. Although artillery fire could be directed against positions located in the hillsides and ravines, it accomplished little toward neutralizing the powerful guns that were installed within the caves themselves. By the morning of the 10th of January, troops of the 43rd Division were in positions from San Jacinto to Rabon. After containing and then bypassing a strong concentration of Japanese entrenched in the Binde area, the 6th Division was moving eastward toward Urdaneta and San Carlos. But as they advanced through the hilly terrain, they were continually delayed by sporadic artillery fire and increasing resistance from the enemy. At the same time, fighting intensified throughout the entire I Corps zone. In an effort to break through this strong defence line, the I Corps commander ordered General Swift to employ tank battalions and regimental combat teams in coordinated attacks. By the 12th of January, additional reinforcements had reached the beachhead, including 3 battalions of the 3rd Infantry Division and a battalion of the 2nd Armoured Division. The regimental combat teams, augmented by heavy artillery fire, gradually began to push the enemy back through his well-fortified defensive positions. After 4 days of fighting, the entire 3rd Corps had succeeded in advancing approximately 7 miles, making only slow headway. By the 14th of January, the I Corps was still engaged in an all-out attack against the enemy stronghold. While the 6th Division made a small gain in the San Carlos area, the 43rd Division captured the enemy positions at Binalonan. On the 15th of January, 2 separate assaults were launched against the Japanese defences along the main road leading to Baguio. On the left, the 43rd Division successfully stormed a series of hills, while on the right, the 6th Division captured and secured the road junction at Urdaneta. Both assaults were conducted at night and were highly successful in surprising the enemy forces. On the 16th of January, General Swift pushed both divisions toward the mountains, engaging the enemy at every turn. In the north, the 6th Division captured Mount Puso and cut off a Japanese unit that was attempting to withdraw to the west. The Japanese forces were becoming increasingly isolated and were unable to maintain any effective lines of communication. As the Allied advance continued, they began to take heavy losses. By the 18th of January, the 43rd Division had cleared the town of Binalonan, allowing the 6th Division to move westward toward Dagupan. With the capture of the major cities of Dagupan and Urdaneta, the I Corps had successfully secured a foothold in the central Luzon region. They were now in a prime position to push further east toward the Cagayan Valley and eventually toward Manila. A highly developed irrigation system, fed by numerous streams coursing down from the surrounding mountains, turns this vast region into an immensely fertile valley for the profitable cultivation of rice, sugar, and other staples. With its extensive plantations and well-developed transportation system of railroads and motor highways, the Central Plain constitutes the wealthiest and most important area in the Philippines. XN Corps' 37th and 40th Divisions, moving in parallel columns southward from Lingayen into the Central Plain, were virtually unopposed by the Japanese. The 40th Division moved along Highway No. 13, while the 37th Division, about 8 miles on the left, advanced down a second highway that runs from Lingayen to San Carlos and Bayambang. On the 12th of January, the front line of XN Corps ran from Bayambang on the east flank to Aguilar on the west. By the 15th of January, the Agno River had been crossed, and still the Japanese had not been encountered in any sizable force. Advance patrols of the 40th Division, instead of meeting enemy machine guns and mortars, were greeted by joyous civilians who lined the roads and shouted encouragement. In fact, the very rapidity of the advance, coupled with the conspicuous failure of the Japanese to employ their usual tactics of defending key road positions, created a suspicion that some trap was in the making, based on the hope that the Allied forces would overextend their lines. 14th Corps, therefore, kept a wary eye to the east, since its left flank was somewhat exposed when I Corps to the northeast was blocked in its drive by the heavy enemy defences in the Cabaruan Hills. To safeguard this open flank, 14th Corps turned temporarily westward to seize Paniqui and Anao before continuing its southward movement. With both these positions in Allied hands by the 19th of January, the advance to Manila was resumed. On the 21st of January, the 40th Division occupied Tarlac without opposition, while the 37th Division to the east held the line at Victoria. The advance of the 40th Division continued unabated until it reached the Bamban River. The Japanese had left a small garrison at this point to delay the capture of the airfield near Bamban, and a brief but sharp skirmish ensued before the troops of the 40th Division were able to move ahead. As the forward drive continued southward from Bamban toward Fort Stotzenburg, the American forces began to encounter increasingly strong pockets of resistance, indicating that they were approaching the first outposts of the Japanese defense line. On the 24th of January, 14th Corps regrouped its 2 divisions and prepared for a coordinated advance in full strength. By the 26th of January, just 17 days from the date of landing, 14th Corps had advanced 59 miles to reach forward positions extending 24 miles, with 77 miles held by the 40th Division and 47 miles controlled by the 37th Division. The lack of enemy opposition to the 40th Division's advance west of the Agno River was not a trap, but part of General Yamashita's general plan of defense. Forced to dispatch the cream of his original combat forces to the bitterly contested operation on Leyte, He no longer saw any possibility of winning decisive victories on Luzon. At first he had hoped that if additional replacements were sent from Japan, he could strengthen his thinly spread lines sufficiently to allow an aggressive and full-scale battle against the expected invasion forces. By the end of November, however, the decimation of the Japanese troops on Leyte and the tardy arrival of reinforcements from Japan convinced him that his only course of action was one that embodied a delaying defence to postpone the inevitable destruction of his forces as long as possible and gain time for the other Japanese forces north of Luzon. On the 9th of December, General Yamashita issued a final plan under which the main strength of his forces was to be deployed to hold the northern Luzon area and protect the main approaches to the fertile Cagayan Valley, plate number 76. In addition, certain key sectors, especially around the region west of Clark Field, later organized under the Kembu Group, and in the mountainous and strategic region east of Manila, later under the command of the Shimbu Group, were also to be defended in strength. The forces at these points were ordered to coordinate their operations with the objective of containing the main body of the American forces on Luzon, destroying its fighting strength, and preparing for protracted resistance on an independent, self-sufficient basis. Although General Yamashita was prepared to fight the landing forces in the eastern sector of Lingayen Gulf, along roads leading to his headquarters at Baguio, he contemplated no more than a token effort in the sector west of the Agno River. He felt that lack of air and artillery support for his fuel-short tanks and their consequent lack of mobility, combined with a scarcity of combat troops, allowed no adequate defence of the wide plain running down from the Lingayen beaches southwest of the river. Accordingly, he directed, "Against an enemy planning to land on the western peninsula of Lingayen Gulf, endeavour to reduce his fighting strength through raiding attacks using locally stationed units. Because the American landings on the eastern shores of Lingayen Gulf directly threatened his northern defence sector, General Yamashita made a few hurried modifications to the 19th of December plan. Strengthening the area surrounding his headquarters at Baguio, he disposed his forces as follows. The 19th Division was placed in the San Fernando area, the 58th Independent Mixed Brigade from Naguilian to Rosario, and the newly arrived 23rd Division from Rosario to Urdaneta and the Cabarruan Hills. This last division had suffered shattering losses en route to Luzon as a result of heavy Allied attacks. Supporting the 23rd Division was the 7th Tank Regiment, reinforced. Japanese efforts to transfer their troops into position according to the orders of the hastily drawn Luzon defence plan of the 9th of December were seriously disrupted by the constant attacks of American aircraft on their transportation systems. In addition, the ceaseless harassing tactics of guerrilla units played havoc with their communication lines. As a result, General MacArthur's invasion of Luzon on the 9th of January gave these forces little, and in some cases no, time for the proper preparation of their assigned defences. Many units were caught in the process of reorganising or before their transfer movement could be completed. Contact between field troops and headquarters was poor, and some elements were cut off entirely as soon as the American troops began to push inland from their beachheads. While 14th Corps battled its way into the Clark Field Fort Stotzenburg area, General MacArthur moved another force to the shores of Luzon. On the 29th of January, 2nd Corps, commanded by Major General Charles P. Hall and consisting of the 38th Division and the 34th RCT of the 24th Division, landed on the west coast of Zambales province to push an additional wedge toward the Central Plain and Manila. This landing was also intended to prevent the enemy from attempting to duplicate General MacArthur's successful strategy of 3 years before in withdrawing into Bataan Peninsula for a prolonged and stubborn defence. The assault force, carried by the 7th Fleet from Leyte through the Sulu Sea and Mindoro Strait, went ashore in the San Felipe-San Antonio area and began its advance inland. Acting upon information furnished by guerrillas of the Zambales military district, the pre-arranged naval bombardment had been cancelled, although naval support remained to assist with call fire if necessary. There was no opposition at the beaches, and after securing the airstrip at San Marcelino and occupying Grande Island at the entrance to Subic Bay, The main body of Cuetan Corps pressed southeastward toward Castillejos and the town of Subic. Progress was unimpeded, and by the evening of the day of invasion, both of these positions were in American hands. During the next morning, Cuan Corps moved into Olongapo, and by the 5th of February, the vital passes to the Dinalupijan-Hermosa road were denied to the enemy by flanking forces of the 38th Division and advance elements of the 40th Division. Any hostile movement to or from Bataan Peninsula was now blocked. Woman Corps resumed its attack along Highway No. 7, but began to meet stubborn resistance as it approached well-entrenched Japanese forces and the rough terrain in the mountains of the Zigzag region. Zigzag Pass was strongly defended by mutually supporting concealed caves and excellently camouflaged concrete emplacements. A deadly stream of machine gun and mortar fire poured out from these defences, taking a heavy toll of the probing advance elements of the 34th RCT. After severe fighting and with the timely aid of several napalm bombing strikes by 5th Air Force planes, Highway No. 7 was finally opened to traffic by the 4th of February. Peunt Corps continued to the south and east to secure Bataan Peninsula and also to assist in the opening of Manila Bay, while Twomont Corps to the southwest was advancing across Zambales province, and I Corps was still hammering away at the tenacious and deeply entrenched Japanese forces in the hills and mountain ranges northeast of the Central Plain. 14th Corps prepared to attack the Clarkfield Fort Stotzenburg defences. It was apparent from the strength and disposition of the opposing forces that the advance of 14th Corps to Manila would be materially affected by the evident enemy determination to make any capture of the airfield area as costly as possible. The question arose whether to contain the defended region with the 40th Division and move on to Manila with the 37th Division, or whether to launch a combined assault with the full strength of both divisions. There were numerous indications that the Japanese occupied the hills west of the main highway in considerable depth. Enemy counterattacks in force against the 40th Division, if it were left unsupported, could conceivably cut eastward to cross the highway and interrupt the 13th Corps' line of supply to any forward units. The Corps commander, General Griswold, decided therefore to throw the entire weight of the Corps into a drive that would push the enemy forces westward into the hills and away from the highway. With the immediate areas of Clarkfield and Fort Stotzenburg secure, the 37th Division could then resume the advance to Manila. The 40th Division, meanwhile, would push southwestward to pinch off the enemy by a juncture with 2nd Corps advancing northeastward along Highway No. 7. On the night of the 27th of January, while the 40th Division inched slowly across the rugged ground of the Bamban Hills on the west, the 37th Division launched a combined tank and infantry attack against Clarkfield and Fort Stotzenburg from the east. The 37th Division moved steadily into the objective area against heavy automatic and artillery fire, thickly sown tank mines, and numerous enemy counterattacks. By the 29th of January, despite this fierce resistance, both Clarkfield and Fort Stotzenburg had been captured and occupied by 13th Corps troops. The next day, in response to an invitation from General Griswold, General Kruger officiated at the flag-raising ceremony. With Japanese artillery shells still falling on the western edge of the military reservation, the Stars and Stripes were flown once again over the post, where, a little over 3 years before, General Wainwright had received the first startling news of the attack against Pearl Harbor. In their hasty retreat into the mountains, the Japanese were forced to abandon huge quantities of supplies to the advancing troops of the Sixth Army. A communiqué of the 29th of January reported, "Tremendous deposits of enemy quartermaster, signal, ordnance, and air technical supplies captured in the Clarkfield area include over 200 new aircraft engines, many radio transmitters and receivers, great quantities of miscellaneous radio and telephone equipment, several months' stores of ammunition, food and equipment, and about 40 artillery pieces of various calibers." The 40th Division found it a difficult task to contain the enemy north and west of Fort Stotzenburg. The Japanese had chosen an ideal location from which to make their defence. The terrain in this region is characterized by steep ridges and isolated peaks interspersed with deep ravines and narrow, winding defiles, which are usually the only paths of access to the main roads. Murderous machine gun and artillery fire from cave positions in the cliffs made any advance difficult and costly. At times, the reduction of each cave individually was necessary before the American troops could move on to their next position. By the beginning of February, the advance elements of the 40th Division, 14th Corps, and the 38th Division 20th Corps were in contact at WWII on Highway No. 7. The 37th Division, after securing the Fort Stotzenberg area, was reforming in preparation for the drive to Manila. To the north, I Corps was moving slowly eastward. The 43rd Division had captured Pozorubio on the 18th of January and pushed on against stiff resistance through Pimilapil and Concepcion to improve its position on the Damotis-Rosario road. The 25th Division, battling courageously against a stubborn enemy southwest of Asingan, progressed toward Baligayan. On the right flank of I Corps, the 6th Division had driven through the Cabaruan hills to occupy Urdaneta, and advance forces of the division were pressing southwest toward Talavera and Muñoz. The final drive to Manila was initiated by General Kruger's Field Order No. 46, issued on the 30th of January 1945. This order fixed the boundary between 14th Corps and I Corps, putting the towns of Dagupan, San Carlos, Malasiqui, Carmen, and Victoria within the 14th Corps zone, and the positions from Licab to Cabu and Tarnala in the I Corps zone. The line of demarcation on the southwest, between 14th Corps and 6th Corps, ran from Purak on the west coast through Dinalupihan and Orani. The 1st Cavalry Division, which had landed on Luzon on the 27th of January, was attached to 14th Corps 4 days later with orders to approach Manila on the left flank of the 37th Division by initiating an advance across the Pampanga River to secure the line from Hagonoy through Cebu Springs and Cabanatuan. In the early morning hours of the 1st of February, the 1st Cavalry Division, under Brigadier General Vern D. Mudge, moved out of its assembly area at Gimba and began an advance southward. The Pampanga River was quickly crossed, and by evening, advance elements of the division had penetrated as far as Cabanatuan. Here, 2 squadrons of Brigadier General John H. Stadler's 1st Cavalry Brigade formed a flying column in conjunction with the 44th Tank Battalion and moved in swiftly to surprise the Cabanatuan defenders. The Japanese had placed a 3,000-pound charge of dynamite to destroy the bridge across the Pampanga River and planned to detonate the explosives with mortar fire before the American troops could effect a crossing. Quick action by General Mudge in leading his men onto the bridge to throw the dynamite into the river, even though the mortar shells had already begun to fall, foiled the enemy plan, preserved the bridge intact, and enabled the cavalrymen to proceed with little difficulty. Once the bridge was crossed, further progress was relatively unopposed as forward elements of the 1st Cavalry Division raced down Highway No. 5 to contact units of the 37th Division at Plaridel near the Angat River. The movement of the 37th Division along Highway No. 3 was greatly impeded by the thorough demolition work of the retreating Japanese, as a result of which almost every important bridge along the route of advance had been destroyed. On the 2nd of February, elements of the division passed through Kalumpit and Malolos, while other units engaged an enemy roadblock just north of Plaridel, close by the Angat River, where first contact was made with the cavalry patrols. After a bitter all-night battle, Plaridel and the river crossing were secured. The 1st Cavalry Division, meanwhile, forded this river at a point to the east and then continued on rapidly toward Novaliches. By evening, 14th Corps, fulfilling its assigned task, held the line from Hagonoy through Cebu Springs to Cabanatuan. General Kruger's strategy for retaking Manila involved an assault on the capital from 2 directions. The 1st Cavalry and 37th Divisions of the 14th Corps would launch the main attack from the north, while a smaller but nonetheless strong effort would be carried out on the south by combined airborne and infantry forces. On the 31st of January, the 8th Army landed troops of the 11th Airborne and 24th Divisions on Batangas Province to form the lower jaw of the Manila pincer movement. The 11th Airborne Division, less the 511th Parachute Infantry, but reinforced by 2 battalions of the 24th Division, landed by water to establish a virtually uncontested beachhead at Nasugbu, a little over 30 miles southwest of Cavite. The kamikaze thrusts of small enemy torpedo boats attempting to attack the landing craft were promptly and easily crushed. General MacArthur described the tactical implications of this landing as follows. This operation places the Eighth Army on the south side of Manila, which is now the center of the converging columns of the Sixth and Eighth Armies. It largely seals off the possibility of the enemy troops south of Manila joining those to the north, and definitely outflanks the enemy's defence lines in southern Luzon. On the 3rd of February, the remaining parachute regiment dropped on Tagaytay Ridge on the north shore of Lake Taal. A juncture of the two forces was quickly effected, and the combined paratroop units moved northward along Highway No. 17 toward Manila. Opposition was slight, and the troops drove rapidly ahead until they reached the permanent concrete and steel emplacements that guarded Nichols Field. Here the division halted to consolidate until heavy artillery could be brought in from 14th Corps. Both the northern and southern outskirts of Manila were now reached, but the relative ease of movement that had characterized the American advance down the Central Plain was by no means an indication of the nature of subsequent progress. Although General Yamashita had begun to evacuate the bulk of his forces and supplies from the Manila area in mid-December, while the Allies were carrying out their invasion of Mindoro, American intelligence estimates listed between 15,000 and 18,000 enemy troops still remaining entrenched within the city. These troops, consisting mostly of naval base units, were intended not only to protect the removal of the rest of the vast quantities of supplies and equipment which had been stored in the capital, but also to deny the use of Manila's harbour facilities, airfields, and other important installations for as long as possible. Although the defences inside the city were generally improvised and adapted to meet a rapidly shifting tactical situation, the tenacity and bitterness of the resistance encountered made the American seizure of central Manila an exhaustive and prolonged effort. As the forward elements of the 1st Cavalry Division advanced from the Angat River, word was brought that some 4,000 American and other Allied prisoners were interned at Santo Tomas University, and that others might possibly be held at Malacanang Palace. The same flying column that had effectively spearheaded the drive into Cabanatuan was immediately dispatched to free these internees lest they be harmed while the battle for Manila was in progress. At dawn on the 3rd of February, the cavalrymen left Santa Maria and sped swiftly southward. The bridge at Novaliches over the Tuliahan River was reached just in time to extinguish the still-burning fuses of an enemy demolition charge. After the bridge was crossed, numerous small groups of Japanese in ambush along the road tried to delay the advancing troops with small arms fire. When the cavalrymen entered the northern suburbs of Manila, the hangars and airfield equipment at Grace Park were already ablaze, and little could be saved. The flying column proceeded down Rizal Avenue to Santo Tomas University, meanwhile diverting one troop of cavalry and a platoon of tanks to Malacanang Palace. Resistance on the university grounds was stiff, but, with tank support, the Americans forced the main gates and wiped out the enemy troops in the area. All internees were liberated, with the exception of 221, who were held as temporary hostages and released the following morning. Malacanang Palace was also reached against sporadic rifle fire from across the Pasig River, but only Filipino police guards and attendants were found to occupy the building. The bulk of the remaining cavalry units was assembled in the vicinity of Novaliches by the 3rd of February. Further progress was temporarily interrupted while repairs were made on the bridge, which the enemy had finally managed to destroy after the flying column had passed. The advance was soon resumed, however, and by the 5th of February the cavalry troops had begun to gather in the Grace Park area. After its brief contact with patrols of the 1st Cavalry Division at the Angat River, the 37th Division pushed along Highway No. 3 against constant automatic and mortar fire. The Japanese had blown the bridges at every stream crossing, and progress was relatively slow. Malande and Caloocan were occupied on the 4th of February, and Manila was entered on the same day. The division effected its own rescue mission when some of its units entered Bilibid prison and discovered 800 American prisoners of war who had been abandoned by their jailers. The brilliant record of the Sixth Army in the release of prisoners of war and internees on Luzon was described in a communiqué of the 6th of February. The 37th Infantry Division, in capturing Bilibid Prison, released more than 800 prisoners of war and about 500 civilian internees, including women and children. With the 3,700 internees from Santo Tomas released by the 1st Cavalry Division, this brings the total rescued to approximately 5,000. About 4,000 were Americans, and the rest British, Australian, and other nationalities. Every facility of the armed forces is being devoted to the care and attention of those who have been rescued. As the 37th Division approached the Pasig River, it was met by a devastating enemy machine gun and rifle barrage. Incessant detonations and collapsing structures filled the air with deafening concussions. The entire sky was lit with the roaring fires of conflagrant buildings, and at times the mixture of smoke, heat, and dust became so overpowering that substantial progress through the city became almost impossible. Amid this holocaust and bedlam, elements of the division effected a crossing of the Pasig River near the presidential palace. The entire 14th Corps then began an envelopment from the east, as troops of the 1st Cavalry and 37th Divisions pushed laboriously through the streets and avenues of the capital toward Manila Bay. General MacArthur's victorious entry into Manila was made on the 7th of February. A group of officers and men, which included General Griswold, General Mudge, General Chase, and part of the flying column which had so recently distinguished itself, met him at the city limits. General MacArthur congratulated everyone on a job well done, and then drove through the war-torn Philippine capital amidst the acclaim of a grateful populace. Sniping and artillery fire continued in almost every section of the city as he visited the Malacanang Palace and the front-line troops engaging the enemy along the Pasig River. On the 10th of February, control of the 11th Airborne Division, drawn up south of Manila, passed from the 8th Army to the 6th Army. On the same day, ex-corps artillery poured a steady concentration from the north into the enemy concrete installations on Nichols Field, placing the shells with deadly accuracy in front of the forward paratroop positions. Under cover of this barrage, the Airborne Division moved its tanks against the thick pillboxes. General Swing's plan was to circle northward and move on the west flank of the Japanese defense line. By the end of the day, the paratroops had seized positions to within 1,000 yards of the Polo Club, the main core of enemy resistance northwest of the airfield. Thus, in the first week of February, General MacArthur had 3 divisions inside Manila. The 37th Division, attacking south across the Pasig River and on toward the Intramuros area, the 1st Cavalry Division, moving southwestward across San Juan Heights toward Nielsen Field, and the 11th Airborne Division, pressing north and east across Nichols Field toward Fort McKinley. Despite this sizable force, the occupation and clearing of Manila was an arduous task. The Japanese troops in the city fought bitterly, knowing that their chances of escape were small. Improvised positions were set up behind piles of fallen debris, barricaded windows, and sandbagged doorways. Every vantage point was manned and fiercely defended with a solid curtain of machine gun and rifle fire. The heaviest fighting took place in the sector assigned to the 37th Division. The Japanese in this area struck out viciously from every position, fighting from building to building and from room to room without surrender. It was not until the 7th of February that the division was able to launch its assault on the Intramuros, the venerable 16th-century citadel in western Manila near the mouth of the Pasig River. Even by modern standards, this ancient, walled city was a formidable fortress, ringed with a stone wall 15 feet high and widening from 8 to 20 feet at the top to 20 to 40 feet at the base. 4 of the main gates were covered by mutually protecting redoubts backed by a heavily fortified concrete building. Complicating the problem of breaching this massive bastion was the fact that many non-belligerents, mostly women and children, were within the city. Because of these helplessly imprisoned civilians, all thought of pulverization of the Intramuros area by air bombardment had to be abandoned. A plea was broadcast to the Japanese entrenched within, either to surrender or at least to evacuate the civilian population, and prevent unnecessary bloodshed. No answer was received. There was no choice but to order a time-consuming infantry assault to move in, after the way had been prepared by artillery and mortars. The attack started with 105 mm and 155 mm howitzer shells, blasting huge chunks out of the ancient walls. On the 19th, under cover of a heavy smokescreen, 37th Division troops began to pour through the breaches and over the rubble to meet the waiting Japanese. The enemy positions in the immediate vicinity of the walls had been effectively destroyed by the terrific power of the preliminary bombardment, and the initial incursions of the American forces met with comparatively light losses. Resistance mounted swiftly, however, as the troops advanced. To add to the difficulty, movement became greatly impeded by the streams of refugees that swarmed out of the buildings and milled around the streets. Fire had to be withheld until these scattered masses of civilians could be removed from the battle zone. By the 24th of February, after a week of savage fighting characterized by numerous hand-to-hand engagements and room-to-room combat, the entire Intramuros was in Allied hands. On the 28th of February, General MacArthur made the following address upon re-establishing the Commonwealth government in the city of Manila. More than 3 years have elapsed, years of bitterness, struggle, and sacrifice, since I withdrew our forces and installations from this beautiful city that, open and undefended, its churches, monuments, and cultural centres might, in accordance with the rules of warfare, be spared the violence of military ravage. The enemy would not have it so, and much that I sought to preserve has been unnecessarily destroyed by his desperate action at bay. But by these deeds he has wantonly fixed the future pattern of his own doom. Then we were but a small force struggling to stem the advance of overwhelming hordes treacherously hurled against us, behind the mask of professed friendship and international goodwill. That struggle was not in vain. I sought to suppress it by brutality of the sword. An army of free men has brought your people once again under democracy's banner, to rededicate their churches, long desecrated, to the glory of God and public worship, to reopen their schools to liberal education, to till the soil and reap its harvest without fear of confiscation, to re-establish their industries that they may again enjoy the profit from the sweat of their own toil, and to restore the sanctity and happiness of their homes, unafraid of violent intrusion. Thus, to millions of your now liberated people comes the opportunity to pledge themselves, their hearts, their minds, and their hands, to the task of building a new and stronger nation, a nation consecrated in the blood nobly shed that this day might be, a nation dedicated to making imperishable those sacred liberties for which we have fought and many have died. On behalf of my government, I now solemnly declare, Mr. President, the full powers and responsibilities under the Constitution restored to the Commonwealth, whose seal is here re-established as provided by law. Your country thus is again in liberty to pursue its destiny to an honoured position in the family of free nations. Your capital city, cruelly punished though it be, has regained its rightful place, citadel of democracy in the East. On 9 and the 10th of February, units of the 1st Cavalry Division crossed the Pasig River and fanned out in 3 directions, toward Manila Bay on the west, Nielsen Field on the south, and Fort McKinley on the southeast. Elements of the 11th Airborne Division, meanwhile, swept the enemy from Nichols Field by the 13th and moved on to Nielsen Field and Fort McKinley. Rather than be caught between the two advancing forces, the Japanese abandoned Nielsen Field without a struggle. During the last 2 weeks of February, the enemy defences throughout the city were reduced to widely scattered and rapidly shrinking pockets of opposition. Rizal Stadium, Fort McKinley, and the buildings along the harbour district were occupied after short but intense fighting. On the 3rd of March, the last organised enemy defences in the Welfare Park area were overcome. The battle for Manila was over. After the capture of Zigzag Pass and the opening of Highway No. 7 on the 14th of February, Corps continued on its mission to occupy Bataan Peninsula and clear the entrance to Manila Bay. To strengthen the Corps, one regiment of the 6th Division, the 1st Infantry, which had been relieved at Urdaneta by the 25th Division on the 18th of January, was attached to the 38th Division. For the recapture of Bataan, two forces were designated to carry out simultaneous operations along both sides of the peninsula. On the 15th of February, a south force of the 151st RCT, 38th Division, sailed from Olongapo on Subic Bay and landed at Mariveles on Bataan's south coast to take up the advance northward along Highway 110. Meanwhile, an east force of the 1st Infantry, 6th Division, moved overland from Dinalupihan on the northern end of this same highway and advanced down Bataan's east coast to establish contact with the south force. The 1st Infantry also had the mission of securing Highway No. 3, which runs laterally across Bataan from Pilar on the east to Bagash on the west. The east force seized Pilar without opposition, and after diverting 2 battalions westward along Highway No. 3, it continued south against scattered resistance to take Orion and Limay in quick succession. Progress of the south force was delayed only by a group of fortified enemy pillboxes in the mountains immediately northeast of Mariveles. This obstacle was quickly eliminated, however, and the advance was resumed. By the 18th of February, both forces had joined at Limay to occupy the entire length of the highway along the east coast of Bataan. A coordinated attack by 38th Division forces, assisted by 5th Air Force planes, dislodged the stubbornly resisting groups of Japanese infantry who were deeply entrenched near Bagak along Highway No. 3. By the 21st of February, the 38th Division had secured all objectives on the peninsula. Thus, within the short space of 7 days, Bataan was once more in American hands. Just as in the dark days of 1942, when the fall of Bataan had preceded the capitulation of Corregidor, so now, almost 3 years later, with the roles of the opposing armies completely reversed, the recapture of the peninsula was a prelude to the recovery of the Rock. Corregidor had been pounded steadily from the sea and air since the last week in January. In addition to the heavy naval shelling, the 5th Air Force alone had dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs and napalm in some 2,000 sorties, shattering the island's outer fortifications and crumbling the exposed concrete installations into a mass of jagged rubble. On the 16th of February, after a last powerful naval bombardment, Quant Corps launched a coordinated airborne and seaborne invasion against the strategic rock fortress. A battalion of the 503rd Parachute Infantry made the first assault, dropping on the western portion of the island. It was followed shortly afterward by a battalion of the 34th RCT, which landed by water on San Jose Beach, slightly southwest of Malinta Hill. Another battalion of airborne troops was dropped later that afternoon, but because of the extremely rough terrain in the landing area and the increasing casualties from heavy enemy fire, the 3rd Battalion of paratroops came in by water on the following day. The 503rd Parachute Infantry and the battalion of the 34th RCT quickly joined forces to eliminate the main system of cave and tunnel defences running through the Malinta Hill district. The Japanese fought to the bitter end, defending each position with devastating fire. Rather than be dislodged by the irresistible onslaught of tanks, bazookas and flamethrowers, they blew up many of their tunnels in suicidal desperation. During the night of the 23rd of February, a terrific explosion from the vast ammunition stores in Malinta Hill shook the entire island of Corregidor and sent its reverberations along the whole of Manila Harbour. Although these self-sealing tactics did cause many casualties to American troops caught in the immediate vicinity of the blasts, the overall effect was to lighten the task of cleaning out each individual cave. By the 27th of February, the American forces had seized complete control of all commanding ground on the island, and on the next day Corregidor was pronounced secured. The 12-day fight had been vicious and bloody. Virtually the entire Japanese force of 4,700 troops had been annihilated, with only a handful taken as prisoners. A sombre and undeniable attestation to the tenacity of the enemy's resistance was evident. Another chapter had been added to the long story of bitter battles that characterized the campaigns in the Southwest Pacific area. The capture of Corregidor by United States forces marked a historic milestone in the war against Japan. The Rock, after a hard and bitter 3-year campaign that carried General MacArthur to Australia and back, was again in American hands. For the Commander-in-Chief, this was more than a victory in arms over the enemy. It was the fulfillment of a personal crusade. In a stirring ceremony on March 2nd, General MacArthur, in the presence of members of his pre-war staff, gave orders to raise the colours once more over the tiny, battle-scarred island. Meanwhile, the operational area of Tiwancore had been expanded to include the enemy's Kembu defence sector west of Fort Stotzenburg. On February 21st, the Corps assumed responsibility for the direction of the 40th Division, which had been engaged in the arduous task of clearing large concentrations of well-equipped and tough Japanese troops from their strongly prepared hill positions in the Zambales Mountains. On February 26th, the exhausted troops of the 40th Division were replaced by the 43rd Division, which, in turn, was relieved of its mission in the I Corps zone by the newly arrived 33rd Division. The 43rd Division was ordered to launch a coordinated frontal and enveloping attack to eliminate the main centres of resistance in the Zambales area. Substantial advances were made on all fronts, and on March 7th the 43rd Division was again withdrawn, this time for action in the region east of Manila, while the 38th Division moved up from Bataan to continue the attack in Zambales and complete the detailed mopping up of both provinces. Manila had fallen, Bataan and Zambales provinces were occupied, and Corregidor had been recaptured, but the toughest fighting of the Luzon campaign was still ahead. In consonance with his general plan for a protracted defence of the island, General Yamashita had grouped his forces in strategic positions to protect the approaches to the Cagayan Valley and the mountain fastness of northern Luzon. There was still much action ahead for 13th Corps in the Batangas and Bicol regions, but the Yamashita line, extending from Antipolo in the south through the hills around Montalban and IPO dams to Cabanatuan and then into the northern mountains, was to prove the greatest obstacle to the battling forces of the Sixth Army. The portion of the Yamashita line that ran east of Manila from Antipolo through Montalban to IPO Dam was known as the Shimbu Line, defended by a heterogeneous collection of Japanese combat and service units numbering approximately 30,000 troops. These troops were distributed among 3 enemy forces protecting the main positions east and northeast of Manila: the Kawashima Force in the northern IPO sector, the Kobayashi Force in the central Marikina sector, and the Noguchi Force in the Antipolo sector to the south. Additionally, there were about 3,000 miscellaneous troops scattered through the rear areas, and some 9,000 troops that had withdrawn from Manila during the first stages of the battle for the city. These Manila escapees comprised mostly naval units and took little part in the fighting, filtering through the lines toward Infanta and then melting into the mountains along eastern Luzon. The Shimbu line presented a triple threat to 14th Corps since, potentially, the enemy could launch a counterattack against the extended left flank of the Corps, control the vital dams to dominate or destroy the water supply to Manila, or, with long-range artillery, lob shells into the capital itself. The 6th Division, transferred from A Corps to 14th Corps on February 7th, pressed against the central and northern sectors of the enemy's line of defence, while the 1st Cavalry Division and later the 43rd Division moved against the Antipolo region. On March 5th, after the fall of Manila, 14th Corps ordered a combined assault by the 1st Cavalry and 6th Divisions to cut between the Wawa and Antipolo areas and effect an envelopment from the south of the enemy's strongpoints on Mount Mataba and Mount Pakawagan. On March 8th, after a heavy 2-day air bombardment of enemy positions north of Antipolo, 14th Corps began the offensive to the east. Resistance was fierce and progress slow, but by March 14th considerable advances had been made. It was on this date that Major General Edwin D. Patrick, commander of the 6th Division, was fatally struck by a sudden burst of enemy machine gun fire that raked his advance observation position. The formidable cave defences in the Antipolo-Wawa line were well described in a GHQ communiqué. The enemy line of defence consists almost entirely of caves in the hillsides, closely spaced for interlocking fire. A cave normally consists of a 10-foot shaft large enough for a man to climb up or down a rope ladder. At the foot of the shaft, a small tunnel leads to a compartment some 20 by 30 feet. 4 or 5 lateral tunnels lead from the compartment. Just before a lateral reaches the surface slope of the hill, it makes a sharp bend to prevent shelling from entering the tunnel. Against frontal assault methods, the firepower developed from these miniature forts is deadly. Our method of attack consists of preliminary saturating bombardments by air, artillery, and all infantry weapons calculated to confine the enemy within the tunnels. When this has been accomplished, a small demolition group from the infantry moves in with white phosphorus grenades, flamethrowers, and demolitions. Several 100 pounds of explosives are placed inside the entrance to a lateral and blown to close the opening. In this manner, the 4 or 5 laterals are sealed off, and the vertical shaft is then blown from the top. Each cave with its laterals can hold about 25 men. When trapped in this way, the enemy is suffocated to death and destroyed without taking any compensating toll from our troops. As an example, a brigade of the 1st Cavalry Division in 48 hours in the attack now developing took 137 caves, and blew 446 of the outlets to these caves with practically no loss to themselves, while the enemy's loss is estimated at several thousand men. Similar methods have been used throughout the New Guinea and the Philippine campaigns. Progress of the attack is slowed by these methods, but an enormous saving in life and material is achieved. To speed the penetration of the Shimbu defences, General Kruger once more regrouped his forces and ordered a change in the Corps' boundaries. The 43rd Division had already relinquished its task of clearing the Zambales Mountains to the 38th Division and was en route to relieve the 1st Cavalry Division in the Antipolo region. On March 15th, Kwewen Corps replaced 14th Corps in the Shimbu sector, taking over control of the 6th Division and the 43rd Division, less the 145th RCT. 13th Corps was, in turn, assigned the task of clearing Batangas and the Bicol Peninsula. On March 19th, the 6th Division initiated a drive eastward to secure the Wawa Dam sector. The Japanese in this area were committed to a last-ditch defence and were well equipped with mortars, artillery, and even crudely constructed but nevertheless destructive rockets. The dominating enemy positions on Mount Mataba and Mount Pakawagan provided strong protection to Wawa Dam and made the advance of the 6th Division extremely difficult. It was not until the end of March that positions were reached from which direct assaults could be carried out against Mount Mataba. The Japanese poured unceasing fire from the mountain ridges, and all attempts to outflank their positions met with failure. Enemy entrenchments, which were almost inaccessible to ordinary artillery and mortar shelling, were bombarded repeatedly from the air with heavy napalm strikes. Despite all efforts, however, the daily gains were small, and it was not until the end of April that the defences on both mountains yielded to the stubborn pressure of combined infantry, artillery, and air assaults, allowing the 6th Division troops to consolidate for the final drive on Wawa Dam itself. On April 30th, the 6th Division, less the 145th Infantry, tired and depleted from almost continuous fighting since its landing at Lingayen on January 9th, exchanged places with troops of the 38th Division in the Zambales Mountains. Other elements of the 38th Division had completed their task of clearing the remainder of Manila Bay with their capture of Caballo Island by March 29th and of Carabao Island and Fort Drum by April 3rd and April 18th, respectively. The 145th Infantry, which had left Manila on April 18th to relieve the 20th RCT and was comparatively fresh, was attached to the 38th Division to continue the offensive against the Shimbu Line. The 43rd Division, in the southern sector of the Shimbu Line, meanwhile pressed its attack in the Antipolo region. A swift 25-mile sweep eastward by the division's mechanized forces broke through the Japanese defences and resulted in the seizure of numerous fortified positions east of the Morong River Valley. Exploiting this advantage, the division went on to capture Tanay on March 19th, and 3 days later the main fortifications along Mount Tanawan had been eliminated. other units of the division swung through Teresa to seize Mount Kaimayuman northeast of Antipolo. By the end of March, the badly shattered forces of the enemy had been driven into the hills east of the Bosso Bosso River, and the 43rd Division had accomplished its main objective of driving a wedge between the southern and central sectors of the Shimbu Line. The division then turned along the eastern shore of Laguna de Bay to take Mabitak, Siniloan, Fami, Panjil, Paquil, Paete, Longos, and San Juan in quick succession. For the remainder of April, it continued operations in this area, cleaning up bypassed pockets of enemy troops and making contact with elements of the 1st Cavalry Division, 14th Corps, which were moving north near San Juan in Batangas. Thus, by the end of April, the Shimbu Line east of Manila was broken in the south, penetrated in the centre and contained in the north. While Tipuan and 13th Corps were pushing across the southern half of Luzon, I Corps was still battling fiercely against the enemy in the north. The Japanese had committed the major strength of their forces to protect at all costs the main passes to their headquarters at Baguio and to their rice bowl in the Cagayan Valley. When the U.S. 33rd Division relieved the 43rd Division and the 158th RCT in the Rosario region on February 13th, it was directed to assault the Baguio area. Although the division immediately launched a strong three-pronged drive, from Bawang on the coast, from Pugo along the centre, and from Rosario in the south, the operation proved to be bitter and long. Baguio, the pre-war summer capital of the Philippines, at this time served as a headquarters for both General Yamashita's forces and for the collaborationist government. The Japanese protected the mountain roads leading to this city with their usual thoroughness, covering every strategic pass with excellent and mutually supporting fortifications. Daily progress of the 33rd Division through the tortuous hills and along the narrow ridges was slow and painstaking, and, in many cases, the engineers had to carve their own roads over otherwise impassable terrain. Elements of the division moving from the coast were aided in their advance by guerrilla units contacted near Bawang. The key town of Naguilian and its adjacent airstrip on the Bawang-Baguio road were seized by the end of March. Other units of the division slugged along the roads from Pugo and Rosario, seizing commanding terrain positions against fierce opposition. On March 26th, part of the 37th Division was sent to relieve the guerrilla force at San Fernando on the coast. On April 19th, the remainder of the division, fresh from a rest period following the Bambang. Overcoming the rear guard left to protect this retreat, the forces of the 33rd and 37th Divisions entered Baguio on the 26th of April. The 33rd Division spent the next month clearing out the remaining enemy positions in the neighbouring mountains, while the 37th Division moved south to replace the 25th Division in the Balete Pass area. The Japanese defence of the Cagayan Valley centred upon two strategic passes, Balete on Highway No. 5 and Salaksak along the Villa Verde Trail. At the time that General MacArthur's forces were preparing to land at Lingayen Gulf, General Yamashita had ordered the 105th Division to move from the Manila area to reinforce the vital positions at the entrance to the Cagayan Valley. Large stockpiles of ammunition were accumulated in the caves dug along the sharp ridges and heavily wooded mountain slopes. The enemy's utilization of every contour of the terrain for defensive purposes was, as usual, detailed and expert, and the lack of secondary roads added greatly to the strength of his positions. At the beginning of February, I Corps had 3 divisions engaged in the task of breaking into the Cagayan Valley. The veteran 32nd Division had arrived in Luzon at the end of January to take up positions in the San Manuel Asingan region. The 25th Division moved into the central sector of the E Corps line to continue its eastward advance toward the gates of the Cagayan Valley. The 6th Division, meanwhile, drove along the southern flank to Muñoz, a strongly fortified town on the road to San Jose and Balete Pass. The enemy had assembled the bulk of his remaining armour in the Muñoz sector in a strong effort to keep the road into the north open for the transfer of troops and supplies. The main elements of the Japanese 105th Division, moving up from the south, were concentrated at Cabanatuan on the 25th of January, en route along Highway No. 5 to the strategic passes of the Cagayan Valley. The enormous quantities of materiel which had been brought up from Manila and stored at San Jose had to be removed before the escape route into the northern redoubt could be cut off. For these reasons, General Yamashita had ordered the Japanese 2nd Armored Division to make a firm stand in defense of this critical area, to delay the American forces as long as possible. The fight for Muñoz was a hard one. Despite the fact that the town had been blasted by repeated airstrikes, the Japanese troops were able to offer determined and effective resistance. Heavy and accurate fire from well-placed artillery and dug-in tanks, employed as pillboxes, slowed down the advancing American troops. Finally, after a week of heavy fighting in which Muñoz was cut off from the rear, the Japanese attempted an unsuccessful retreat to the north and yielded the battered town to the Americans. The 6th Division then pushed rapidly southeastward to seize Rizal and Bongabon, while strong patrols sliced across to Dingalan Bay on the east coast to cut Luzon in half. On the 14th of February, the 25th Division took over the southeastern flank of I Corps, while the 6th Division was diverted to the attack in the Shimbu region. The 25th and 32nd Divisions then prepared a two-pronged assault to open the last doors to the Cagayan Valley. The 32nd Division speared northeastward to begin a drive along the Villa Verde Trail towards Salaksak, while the 25th Division started to advance from San Jose to Balete along both sides of Highway No. 5. At this time, the 32nd Division occupied the area near Santa Maria at the beginning of the Villa Verde Trail, a narrow corridor that wound along the ravines and cliffs of the Caraballo Mountains past Salaksak and Imugan to join Highway No. 5 at Santa Fe. Following the unchanging pattern of yard-by-yard progress in northern Luzon, the struggle to penetrate the elaborate defense works of the Japanese in this area was intensive and prolonged. The extreme scarcity of water along the first half of the trail, added to the terrific heat and the dust from the roads, made the advance doubly difficult. Careless of life, the enemy fought tenaciously from cave to cave and from foxhole to foxhole, covering each move with protective fire. Heavy Japanese reinforcements were brought down from the north to bolster the defences at Salaksak Pass, and although the 32nd Division had reached this strategic area by mid-April, it was not until the 27th of May that the pass could be secured. Along Highway No. 5, the story of the 25th Division's advance was much the same. The campaign to seize Balete Pass was one of bitter fighting which continued all through March and April and lasted well into May. There were few battles in the Pacific War which were waged along more formidable terrain. General Joseph J. Stilwell, on a visit to the Balete front, commented, "This seems to be as tough as anything could be. In Burma it was thick, almost impenetrable jungle. Here there are cliffs that are almost impossible to scale, as well as the worst sort of mountain terrain. Heavy rainstorms during the latter part of April, flooding already impassable roads, taxed the ingenuity and endurance of the engineers to the utmost. From the end of April to the middle of May, the division made maximum use of aircraft to assist the infantry advance, with an average of 80 planes daily flying tactical support missions. The enemy continued to contest every inch of ground, however, and it was not until the 13th of May that troops of the 25th Division finally broke through Balete Pass. After long, weary weeks of flushing Japanese from their underground burrows, sealing the deep caves, building new roads and improving old trails, the American forces had finally forced an entrance into the Cagayan Valley. Contact between the 25th and 32nd Divisions was made at Imugan, and I Corps began to move on to Santa Fe and into the valley itself. While I Corps endeavoured to enter the fertile Cagayan Valley, I Corps maintained its assaults against the central and northern sectors of the tough Shimbu line. After the 6th Division withdrew to western Luzon at the end of April, the 38th Division increased the pressure in the Wawa Dam area, advancing from Mount Mataba and Mount Pakawagan. At the beginning of May, the 43rd Division relinquished tactical responsibilities in the Laguna de Bay region to the 1st Cavalry Division and moved northward to take up positions for a concerted effort along the IPO Dam front. IPO Dam normally supplied over 30% of Manila's fresh water supply, and its early recapture from the Japanese was imperative to the capital's welfare. On the 6th of May, the 43rd Division initiated the attack to recover the dam. Its drive was aided by guerrilla forces on the other side of the Angat River, which were bearing down on the enemy from the northwest. By the middle of May, the high ground dominating the dam on both the north and south sides had been seized, and the enemy's positions to the west were being pinched off by the Allied forces advancing in a fast, enveloping movement. To speed the drive, 5th Air Force planes poured the heaviest concentration of napalm ever used in the Southwest Pacific on the Japanese defences surrounding the dam. Aided by powerful searchlight illumination of the battle areas during the hours of darkness, the guerrilla units from the north and the 43rd Division from the south continued to advance with unremitting pressure. On the 17th of May, IPO Dam was captured intact, and the critically needed water supply was restored to Manila. The Japanese had set demolition charges along the dam, but the swiftness of its capture had prevented the planned destruction. South of IPO, the 38th Division advanced down the slopes of Mount Pakawagan to seize Mount Binikayan on the 7th of April, and a final base was established for the projected assault of Wawa. Aided by flame-throwing tanks, bulldozers, and air support, the division advanced steadily while the retreating Japanese melted into the hills on both sides of the dam. On the 28th of May, Wawa Dam was secured, also undamaged, against comparatively light resistance. The last important stronghold of the Shimbu Line had been broken, and by the end of June, activity in the Tigun Corps zone consisted of mopping up isolated enemy troops. On the 15th of June, the Corps assumed control of all combat operations on Luzon, south of Cabanatuan, and finally, on the 1st of July, it was relieved of all tactical responsibilities in the Philippines, clearing Batangas and the Bicol Peninsula. After Tufan Corps had relieved Tueturth Corps in the Shimbu sector, the latter assumed the offensive against enemy remnants in southern Luzon. On the 15th of March, the 6th Division, with the 112 RCT attached, passed to the control of 6-1 Corps, and the 37th Division was put in 6th Army Reserve and given the mission of patrolling Manila. 14th Corps now included the 1st Cavalry Division, which had moved south for a 10-day rest at Alabang along Laguna de Bay, and the 11th Airborne Division with the 158th RCT attached. The Corps held a line stretching from Laguna de Bay, southwest to Lake Tayal, and thence to Batangas City, which had been taken on the 10th of March. On the 19th of March, the 1st Cavalry Division on the north and the 11th Airborne on the south were ordered to begin a double enveloping attack toward the centre of Batangas Province. The 1st Cavalry Division's mission was to cover the principal roads running south to the enemy's flank at the foot of Mount Malapunyo, while the 11th Airborne moved on the coastal road leading to Batangas City. Japanese resistance had been almost negligible, and the city was occupied on the 24th of March without any ground action. This major victory contributed greatly to the morale of the soldiers and the security of the important supply route along the south-central coast. The Japanese troops in the Batangas area soon began to retire. The southern forces of the Imperial Japanese Army in the Bicol Peninsula, however, were preparing to hold out against the Allied advance to the last man. Their lines extended south along the eastern side of the peninsula to the vicinity of Mount Isarog, and westward to the northeastern portion of the Batangas province. Organised into an effective, though somewhat isolated, defensive force, they had only scanty food and ammunition. By the beginning of April, the Japanese had begun to consolidate their positions in anticipation of the attacks by Allied forces. The 11th Airborne Division began its advance on the 8th of April. A strong push toward the critical Luzon coastal area was launched, which soon met with heavy enemy fire. Much of the fighting was in dense jungles, where the 11th Airborne's training in parachuting proved valuable in allowing them to gain an advantage over the Japanese forces. Strong artillery support and close air support provided the necessary overwhelming force to finally break the Japanese defensive lines. By the 10th of April, the division was able to secure the town of Naga, the hub of the Bicol Peninsula. The final Japanese defensive positions were overcome by the 24th of April, and the way was opened for a rapid advance toward the southern Luzon coast. With the capture of Naga, the American forces had regained control of the vital routes that connected Luzon with the rest of the Philippines. As the campaign came to a close, the Japanese remnants in the Bicol Peninsula began to surrender in large numbers. The fight for southern Luzon, which had consumed so much time and resources, was finally won. Of Manila arrived at the Baguio front to assist the 33rd Division in its operations. The campaign against the enemy's stronghold at Baguio continued well into April. The Japanese, gradually being forced back into the hills, decided that the city was no longer tenable and began a withdrawal of their main forces into the chain of mountains enclosed by the triangle Baguio-Bontoc. The third drive on Kiangan came from Cervantes, where guerrilla units were striving to move southeastward to scissor through the Kiangan pocket and meet the 6th Division. By the end of June, this last drive had netted over 10 miles and had reached Mankayan. In the Cagayan Valley, the 37th Division continued northeastward from Bagabag, advancing as rapidly as the rate of logistic support would permit. On the 18th of June, the division crossed the Cagayan River south of Ilagan, and the next day secured the town. On the 21st, U.S. Rangers and guerrilla forces assaulted and captured Apari. 2 days later, elements of the 11th Airborne Division dropped by parachute and glider on Camalaniugan Airfield near Apari and drove south in an effort to effect a junction with the 37th Division. Operating between these two forces, guerrilla units fought for Tuguegarao against determined Japanese attacks. The 37th Division reached Tuguegarao on the 25th of June and, pressing onward, met the 11th Airborne Division on the 26th. This union marked the end of organized Japanese resistance in the Cagayan Valley. General MacArthur announced the end of this operation on the 28th of June. Our northern and southern columns have joined forces, securing the entire length of the Cagayan Valley, heart of northern Luzon. This juncture climaxed a campaign that traversed the 200-mile valley in 28 days. Battered enemy remnants had been driven into the rugged mountain ranges to the east and west, cut off from all sources of supply. Except for isolated operations, this closed the major phase of the northern Luzon campaign, one of the most savage and bitterly fought in American history. No terrain has ever presented greater logistical difficulties, and none has ever provided an adversary with more naturally impregnable strongholds. Our troops comprise the Yon Corps and the North Luzon guerrillas, all of the 6th Army, closely and most effectively supported by the Far Eastern Air Force and the 7th Fleet. The entire island of Luzon, embracing 40,420 square miles and a population of 8 million, is now liberated. Only General Yamashita's last stronghold, the Kiangan Pocket, held on with any semblance of organization. The 37th Division, together with guerrilla units in the area, turned east to mop up enemy remnants in the Sierra Madre Mountains. The 6th Division, assisted by guerrilla units, undertook the task of crushing the enemy forces at Kiangan. The liberation of Luzon brought the following message from Secretary of War Stimson to General MacArthur. Your announcement that all Luzon has been liberated marks the achievement of a great military success. It has been brought about with a minimum of casualties. My congratulations go to you and to all officers and men in your command for this most skillful and heroic accomplishment. From my own service in the islands and my close association with their government, I have retained a high respect and warm friendship for the Philippine people. They have suffered cruelly under the Japanese occupation. I share their great rejoicing at the liberation of the main island of their Commonwealth. Your great victory hastens the day when the last of the oppressors will have cleared Philippine soil. At this time, a number of changes were being prepared in the area commands of the Philippines. 4 divisions were assigned to 13th Corps, the 6th, 32nd and 37th from 1st Corps, and the 38th from 7th Corps. On the 15th of June, 14th Corps was directed to move to northern Luzon to relieve 1 Corps headquarters, and on the 1st of July the transfer was effected. On that same date, the 6th Army, exclusive of 14th Corps, was relieved of operational control of American and Filipino forces on Luzon, and was started on a program of training and preparation for its next objective, Japan itself.